When do Tflops matter? Let's talk about it. To say that the console wars are heating up is a mild understatement. I think the full breadth of what is going on is now taking place. Sony last week announced their performance, their specs of their PlayStation 5. And last week, Microsoft also announced the specs of the Xbox Series X. We know that the Sony PlayStation is going to get up to 10.3 teraflops, and we also know that the Xbox One X is going to get sustained 12 teraflops of performance. Now, the point of this video is to talk about comparing Tflops, between consoles and console generations, because it is not a light comparison. You can't compare this generation's performance to last generation console performance. It doesn't work. But first, we need to talk about how Sony and Microsoft are approaching the performance characteristics of their console. Microsoft is taking a sustained approach, which means that they are locking the clock speeds and that you're going to get a sustained 12 teraflops of performance. So what they're telling developers is when you go in and build your games, build your whatever for the next generation console, you need to be targeting 12 teraflops of power, because that is what's there and that is what you're going to get and that is what you have to play with. Now, the downside to that is, let's say they build for that environment, and then there's Michael Bay explosions in a scene and it really taxes the system. Well, they're stuck with 12 teraflops of performance. They don't get any extra buffer benefits anywhere else. So they've got to optimize or find smart ways to make that scene work at 12 teraflops. Now, that is different from how the PlayStation 5 is approaching things. While Sony hasn't officially gone through all the raw specs yet, we know that 10.3 teraflops is the higher end version or capabilities of the processors, 10.3. Doing some basic math, knowing the clock speeds and all that, it looks like 9.2 teraflops is the accurate number for the next generation PlayStation. Now, what that means is that when a developer goes in to build a game, they're going to be targeting 9.2 teraflops. That is the figure that they should be targeting. If they get into a scene where there's a bunch of Michael Bay explosions and they need to optimize things, well, they have a little bit of a boost, right? They can go up to 10.3 to make that scene happen without taking a big tax on the gaming experience. Now, that's a feature that Intel and many other companies call burst speed. It's not new. It's just a feature that says, hey, the clock speed can ramp up temporarily, but we know it's not a 10.3 sustained performance, because if it was, that would just be the actual characteristics, and then it would boost into something else like 11 or 12, but it's not, because it would overheat, it would hurt the chip, it would whatever. It's not sustainable. So Sony is approaching it from 9.2 with a burst, and then Microsoft says, hey, this is what you get. Microsoft fundamentally has the more powerful console. Now, there's also other features at play here as well. One of the things that has not been talked about a lot is the sampler feedback streaming. This is a part of DirectX 12 U, or DirectX 12 Ultimate, that Microsoft has announced, which the Xbox Series X is part of. Xbox Series X is going to be DX12U certified. And one of the things that I think is overlooked, and this is directly from Microsoft's page, it says, because it avoids wastage of loading into memory the portions of textures that are never needed, is an effective 2 to 3x or higher multiplier in both the physical memory and SSD performance. There's been a lot of talk about Sony having a better solid state drive, or Microsoft being lagging behind, and the Series X is going to be a dumpster fire because of its solid state drive. I think that is completely baloney. Now, we won't know full details until we actually get these devices hands-on and somebody can actually rip out the raw I/O on it. But all that being said, I don't think the performance gap between whatever Microsoft is building is whatever Sony is building is going to be big enough that it's going to offset effectively almost 2.5 teraflops of performance, right? So I don't think that the SSD performance is something that people should be latching onto as a, hey, makes this console better. It's going to help. Don't get me wrong. The faster the SSD, the better it is. But Microsoft has some really, really fancy software technologies up its sleeve. And I don't believe that the PlayStation 5 is going to be taking advantage of this. Now, if Sony comes out and says, hey, this is DirectX 12U certified, well, that will change the game a little bit, because that will make it even easier to compare this stuff. But I don't think that is the case at this time. Now, one other thing that needs to be talked about here, because this has been jumping around, is the Xbox Lockhart, or what might be known as the Xbox Series S, is going to be targeting around the 4 teraflops from the best information that we have heard so far. Now, when you compare that to the Xbox One X, which has 6 teraflops, it's like, well, this doesn't make sense. Well, it really does actually make sense. We got to remember that I believe that the Xbox Series S, or the Lockhart, is going to be targeting 1080p 60 frames per second, maybe 1440p, but I think 1080p 60 frames per second likely makes the most sense, because that's what most TVs are, and it's a good console for that. Anyways, my point aside here is that in the Xbox One X that you can go out and buy today that has 6 teraflops of power, the GPU and the architecture is the Jaguar family from AMD, and it is almost a decade old, somewhere between 7 and 10 years old. It is dated, it is outdated, candidly, at this point, and so we're looking at that next generation stuff, and you can't compare these. Why? Well, first off, it's a completely different version of DirectX, so you're losing all that optimization. It's a lot like looking at a 4-cylinder engine that used to get 12 miles a gallon, and now that same 4-cylinder engine gets 28 miles a gallon. It's still a 4-cylinder engine, but it's a lot more optimized. That is what we are seeing with this new generation. The fact that it has almost a decade of silicon improvements, you're going to get more bang for your buck. For every input, you're going to get a more optimized experience, especially if it is DX12U certified, which I would expect Microsoft would do that because that gives them more oomph and more, push for that. It makes it easier for development as well. So when you look at next generation console, comparing it to the Xbox One X, it's not apples to apples. You really can't compare 4 teraflops of performance in a new generation console to 6 teraflops of performance of a silicon chip that is nearly a decade old. You're not going to get the same port performance characteristics, so don't worry that it's less performant. Microsoft is targeting a price point with a Series S, and they're targeting a performance version with the Series X. There's a reason why they're doing this, and you cannot compare 6 teraflops of yesterday to 4 teraflops of tomorrow. Yes, I know raw output does have factors into it, but you can optimize things and get a much better experience with new chips rather than the old technology. Now, I do want to point out one thing. You can compare the series or the PlayStation 5 to the Series X. That is a light comparison. AMD is building both the silicon, AMD is building both the GPU, or the silicon for the CPU and the GPU. It is a light comparison. It is the same generation Navi 2 GPU Zen 2. So in that instance, you can compare 9.2 to 12.